Hello dear learners, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are going to talk about the most sought after, the most popular and the most used framework of the, or the module of the Spring framework, that is Spring MVC. Now Spring MVC is so commonly used these days that you will find every other developer talking about Spring MVC, trying to understand how it works, trying to use it in their project. Over the Spring MVC, there are a lot of other things also that are built up that people use these days. So like this is one of the most talked about, the most popular module in the Spring framework, and validly it has a lot of reasons to be so popular and be so used module of the Spring framework. So today in this particular video we will be highlighting on things that makes the whole Spring MVC module so popular that every other user would want to use it and make it a part of their project. So without further ado, let's get started. When we talk about Spring MVC, there are these three alphabets that we see here, M, V and C, which make a major part of what we are going to talk about in the whole Spring MVC module. Now even before we could jump on to what exactly is Spring MVC, how it is implemented, get into all the nitty-gritty, let's first understand these three alphabets M, V and C, or rather as they are known as model, view and controller. Okay. Now, model, view and controller is a design pattern which has become so popular these days that in most of the frameworks you will find model, view, controller pattern being implemented. Okay, the reason being that it helps you in clearly separating your business, navigation and presentation logic. Now, what do I mean by business, navigation and presentation logic here is that when I say presentation logic, I mean the UI that you're seeing in the front end. Okay, when you go onto a particular website, you see a page, you fill a form, you see a lot of images, videos that you see on the website. That's nothing but the presentation. Okay, you go further, there is something called as navigation, which helps in managing the whole request and response. So whatever incoming request that comes, whatever data that it brings in, giving it to the correct business logic and getting the correct business logic executed and getting or extracting the response from it and giving it back to the presentation layer is the job of the navigation layer. Okay, so again that's also a very important layer that we have. And finally we have the business layer. Business layer is the one which talks to the database, gets the data from the database in whatever format that is expected for the end user. So whatever data for a particular request is needed, getting that data, running some business logic behind it, or performing some calculations if need be, is what business does. So model, view and controller helps you in clearly separating these out, wherein the view talks about the presentation logic, the controller talks about the navigation logic, and the model talks about the business logic. So that's how it is: model, view and controller, business, navigation and presentation logics that are implemented using all these three. Now different frameworks, you will see them implementing in different ways. Okay, Spring also implements it in a very clean and clear way, in such a way that there is no dependency on either of the modules. So Spring is not going to force you to have a particular set of APIs for any of these. Okay, it is so flexible, it allows you to use n number of different APIs which you can use for model, view and controller, or rather I would say for the implementation of model, view and controller. Okay, which is not true in a lot of other frameworks. If you see older frameworks like Struts was there before this, then the J2E framework, then there are other frameworks also which are available these days, but they are not that flexible as flexible is this Spring MVC implementation. That is why it is so popular, it is so sought by developers also as an implementation module. So it is really very dynamic, I'll say, in terms of its implementation, very flexible in terms of allowing you to choose a particular API. We will talk about this in further detail also when we go into more detail of each of these modules, that is model, view and controller, what are the various ways in which you can implement it. We'll see a lot of examples and these things will become more transparent to you, more clearer to you. But if I have to put it into a proper definition of what these each are, so a controller basically handles navigation logic and interacts with the service tier for business logic. So there is usually, along with the controller, there's a service tier which runs the business logic or whatever calculations or whatever conditions that you need to evaluate. All that happens in the service tier. So the controller handles basically this whole navigation of getting a request data, giving it to the business logic, and the business logic then doing whatever processing that it is supposed to, giving back the response, and the controller taking it back to the UI. Okay, we'll see this also in further detail. So that's basically controller. It handles navigation logic. Okay, model is basically a contract between the controller and the view. So what controller does is that whatever data that the view needs is brought into a model and given it to the view. Okay, so model, you can say, contains the data that is needed to render the view, as you can see here. Okay, and this data is populated to the view by the controller. So the controller fetches this data and shows it in the view. So that is how it works. So you can say it's a contract between controller and view. As far as view is concerned, it renders the response to the request and it pulls this data from the model. So model carries that data to the UI. The view pulls that data from model and shows it on the appropriate UI controls. Okay, so that's what it does, right? So these are the three important terms: model, view, and controller. I would like you to pause the video for a minute, go through this. In case if you have any questions, you can put them in the comment section below, or you can even send me a message on LinkedIn, Instagram. We are connected everywhere, so you can drop your message, your queries there, and I'll try and answer your queries. Yeah, so these are the things. Going further, let's take an example. So let's say I have a user who comes in with a request, okay, to me. This request first comes to the view. So basically you are maybe clicking on a form, or you are clicking on an image, or you are requesting some file. So basically it's a request that comes onto the view. So the end user clicks on the view, or maybe opens some page on the view. So that's basically a request that comes to the view. This request, the view then forwards it to the controller. The controller here determines that for which exact module or for which exact API the request is, okay, and it forwards that request to the appropriate API. Okay, then that API, or basically that service module, works and it tries to fetch the data with the help of model. So the model basically does what? It goes and talks to the database and gets us the data. It queries the database and gets the data from the database. Database returns this data back to model. Model gives it in a form that is needed by the controller, or you can say the service layer, and it comes back to the controller. Okay, controller takes this data, formulates it in whatever way that is to be given to the view, and it basically renders this content on the view, and that data, once it is rendered onto the view, is basically given as a response to the user. So this is the whole you can say a cycle that happens, that a request comes in, it goes to the controller manages this request. If needed, it fetches the data from the model, which goes further and queries the native database or your local database or whatever. It basically queries the database, tries to get the data and formulates it in a particular, usually this is in a DTO or in a class. It formats it, puts it into a DTO or a list, and that data is returned back to the controller, and the controller then gives it back to the view. So that is how the whole thing works, that you come in with a request and get back a response. So just again, I would like you to pause the video for a minute, go through this whole flow and see if you are able to understand what is happening. Try to absorb what is happening here and see how it works. Okay. So going further, what exactly is Spring MVC? So Spring MVC provides very rich functionality for building robust web applications. It allows you to create these web applications which you can access from your browsers. Okay, the advantage that Spring gives you is it effortlessly integrates with other web frameworks also, like Struts, Java Surfaces, Tapestry. Although these are with Spring coming into picture, these things aren't that popular these days, but it can integrate with most of the APIs that you can think of, like even with database APIs, or you can say with UI APIs. So any sort of API that you want, it very seamlessly integrates with them without too much of effort given. That is the reason why precisely Spring MVC is so popular, because it so seamlessly, so effortlessly integrates with all these different APIs, and it makes it so flexible and so comfortable for the developer to use it, and work in their own comfort zones also. So let's say if I am someone who is have been working for, let's say, with Hibernate for some 5 years, 10 years now down the line, Spring can very easily integrate with Hibernate and give me a database integration. But on the contrary, if I'm someone who works with a NoSQL kind of database, or maybe if I'm someone who knows how to use JPA, okay, I'm more comfortable with JPA, Spring will very easily go and integrate with frameworks like JPA, frameworks like NoSQL also. So that integration is so seamless and so effortless that it makes it the first choice for developers to go ahead and use it. Similarly, for even UI, or you can say even for the view layer, it is very flexible. It is not going to be tightly coupled with APIs like servlets and JSP. It will allow you to explore different types of views also. Like you can go ahead and use frameworks like Velocity, FreeMarker, Excel, PDF, and many other. These days you also have TimeLeaf and many such technologies which have come up, which you can very easily use and integrate it in your Spring MVC application. And it is only a matter of configuration that you need to do in the configuration file, and it works so easily for you. So it is so dynamic, so flexible, that everyone would want to use it and integrate whatever APIs that they are comfortable with it and make their whole web application work. So that's again one of the reasons why Spring MVC is so popular. As I have been telling from the beginning of the video, it has so many different features and so rich functionality that it allows the end user, or allows the developer, to choose which frameworks you want to integrate, okay, and use them in your application. So there's no restriction or no tight coupling here that you have to use my APIs only. So if you are, I don't know if you're aware of it, but Spring has its own APIs also for all this, database related, UIs related. It already has its own APIs also for each and everything. So you can go ahead and use Spring's own APIs also. But Spring says no, if you don't want to use my APIs, you can have your own, get them integrated with my basic functionalities, and you're good to go. So you can go ahead and use them also. So that's there. Further, if you can see, this is basically a normal request response flow of how it works with Spring. There are a lot of terms that you will see here. Don't worry, I will go in detail for each and every term that you see here. As of now, I would want you to just go ahead and observe what is happening here when a request comes in for a web application through Spring MVC. Okay. So whenever a request comes in, every incoming request first goes to something which is called as a dispatcher servlet. A dispatcher servlet is nothing but a front controller. Okay. Now a front controller is basically like a person sitting on a front desk of an office. Every person walking into an office first goes to the front desk, right? So that's what a dispatcher servlet also plays here as a role. It guards all your incoming requests and forwards it to the appropriate controllers that it needs to go to. Okay, so every incoming request that we have first goes to the dispatcher servlet. Okay. The dispatcher servlet then takes this request to a handler mapping. The handler mapping here basically tells us what controller or what API we need to call from the request that has come in. So with Spring annotations into picture, this particular handler mapping job is done by an annotation called as request mapping. Okay, so the request mapping annotation does this job for you to tell us which particular API to be called when an incoming request comes in. So which, based on incoming request, it determines which API to be called and further goes ahead and calls that controller method. Once the dispatcher servlet determines which controller to go ahead and call the API from, the API receives the request, and then based on whatever request that has come in, the controller or the method inside the controller does the processing or whatever business logic that it is supposed to execute, and it returns back usually a model and view object. Now this is not always true, because these controller methods now are very flexible. They might just return a view also, that is a string which tells you which view it is, and a model is separately handled. So this is not always true that it might return a model and view object. It might not return. It might also return string. So basically the controller returns a view name and a model is determined, okay, separately. So here we will assume as of now that it will return a model and a view and give it back to the dispatcher servlet. The dispatcher servlet does what is, it will take the view name from this model and view object, and it will go ahead and call someone called as a view resolver. Now this view resolver is someone who will determine based on the view name given to it which view page to be called. Like for example, I am giving it a name, let's say customer form. So customer form, let's say, is the view name. Based on the customer form view name, it will resolve that I have to call customer form.jsp page. Let's say it will also determine the location. For example, it can say that inside the webinf folder, inside view folder, so webinf view, and inside that view folder I want customer form.jsp. So that is what a view resolver does. It takes a view name that was customer form, and based on that it determines which exact view page to call. Now this is again not necessary that it will always call a JSP page or a HTML page or that. It can call any sort of view. As I have said earlier, that it is flexible enough to call or support any sort of view. So it will determine which view page to call. Once that is done, the dispatcher servlet will go to that exact view page and pass on the model data to the view page. The view page will render this particular whatever data that comes from the model on the page, generate a response and give it back to the client, so, or the user basically. So that is how the whole request comes in. Starts with the dispatcher servlet, and it is the dispatcher servlet who makes sure it is jumping between the different components that are needed for the whole request to get processed and generate the response. So pause the video again, take a minute, go through the various terms that you can see here, like controller, handler mapping, model and view, dispatcher servlet, view resolver, model. So there are a lot of terms that are there here. I would like you to note down these terms somewhere so that in future videos, when we go through each and every term that you see here, you can come back and relate them to this whole request response flow that you can see here and understand the whole working of it. In our upcoming video, in our next video, we will start talking about all of the various Spring components that you can see here, like how to implement the controller, view and model in Spring, and what are the various components that you will need for it. Like we will talk about what exactly is dispatcher servlet, how it works, how it is implemented. We'll also talk about controller and request mapping annotations and how they work. We will talk about what exactly is an internal resource view resolver and what exactly it does, what it helps us in. We will talk about what exactly is a model attribute or a model class basically, or a parameter as it is passed. And we'll also talk about bean classes here and see how this whole thing works and forms into one single unit for the whole Spring MVC to work. Okay, so that is it for today. Please like my videos if you like my content, share it with your family, friends, to whoever it is relevant to, and please like my videos and subscribe to my channel, and please watch the videos end to end so that you're not missing on to all those small details that are there, small terms, concepts that I discuss. And that is it for today. Thank you. Bye. Have a lovely week ahead.